welcome to this ShelterBox debate on is it a disaster if the cameras are not there? According to the International Red Cross, 90% of disasters go largely unnoticed. Last year, I was in New York visiting my son when Hurricane Sandy came sweeping through. Big worldwide event, 24-hour news coverage which went on in the States and throughout most of the Western world for weeks. The reality was 131 Americans died. In the Caribbean, 135 people died, and it got coverage for virtually a day, and it did not get weeks of coverage. As we speak, there's a food crisis in Malawi. Up to 1 million people face starvation. There is a major crisis around food in Lesotho. Again, another crisis. But the British public, who are enormously generous and give enormous amounts to humanitarian appeals, are not responding to those crises in Malawi and in Lesotho because there is a limited coverage of that within the British media. I know through my work with the DEC that there is a clear link between the media coverage in the UK and the success of our appeals. We work before we launch an appeal on the basis of 3 criteria. Is there a need? Can the 14 humanitarian agencies that we pull together as an umbrella organisation, can they meet that need? And can we be fairly certain that the British public will want to respond and give to that need? And we can only gauge that, and we can only be certain of that with the help of our partners in our rapid response network, principally the big British broadcasters, the BBC, ITV, Sky, Channel 4 and Channel 5. If we don't have their help, if we don't have their support, if we don't have their partnership, we can't raise the millions of pounds that we do raise to meet needs in very difficult and distressing circumstances. Our past 3 appeals, Haiti, the Pakistan floods, and the last year's famine in East Africa, raised more than £70 million. East Africa, in the midst of one of the worst recessions this country has experienced for decades. The tsunami, our greatest amount raised in 2004, £392 million in a matter of weeks. And that was because there was exceptional coverage on the BBC, on ITV, and on Sky, and also on Channel 4 and Channel 5. So I know there's a causal link between the nature of the coverage and the response that you can get from the British public. Tonight we're going to probe that in a debate, and we're going to begin with contributions from each of our 4 panellists, and we're going to look at this relationship between humanitarian aid, the response to the British public, and the British press. Each of our distinguished panel are going to speak for about 4 minutes. There'll be some brief follow-ups from me, then I'm going to throw it open to you. A very distinguished panel, Mike Thompson, the International Affairs Correspondent at the BBC. Look out for his report on Fresh from the Sun tomorrow on the Today programme. Sarah Whitehead, Head of International News at the Sky, just been promoted to Deputy Head of News at Sky. News gathering, sorry. Yes, John Riley may not be amused with that one. Dylan Winder from DFID and Ross Preston from ShelterBox. We'll begin with Mike.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming, and it's very cheering to see you on these sort of topics that we have such a full house. I was asked to talk about the situation as a journalist on the ground when you arrive somewhere and there's been some sort of disaster. A lot of the stories I do aren't only disasters, it may be sort of slow burn situations, like Niger as an example a couple of years ago, where there was a huge problem bubbling up, and it's actually great to be able to get there in front of the the actual disaster, when the bodies are actually starting to fall, and when it's a bit too late in many ways to save a lot of people. You can sometimes turn up in places without much help from aid agencies or anyone really. If you take somewhere like Haiti, for instance, and the awful earthquake there recently, where you get off a plane and you arrive and the story is everywhere. It's all around you, and really preparation, other than finding yourself somewhere to sleep and something to eat, is really unnecessary, because you just look about you and you see the enormous traumas. Just about everyone, any person you meet is a potential interviewee. They've either lost somebody, or they don't know what's happened to their families or whatever. I even found myself talking to one man who turned out to admit to being a gangster, was the term that he actually used, and he described himself as somebody who made his living from theft and mugging. And it was quite touching hearing him talk, actually, when he said, people say, people somehow expect that those like me don't care what's going on, but I've lost my father and I've lost my sister, and it makes me think about my whole life again. It's actually very moving talking to him. You can go to other places like Khartoum, where in Sudan, where if you turn up without arranging anything, it can be a bit tricky. Even in fact, getting to talk to NGOs can be a problem. I remember after 5 days of trying to get into Darfur a few years ago, and waiting, I think, 6 days, which I'm told wasn't bad actually, before I finally got it, I had got some total of one interview, and that was with Oxfam. And Oxfam are great, and it was a good interview actually, but wouldn't be considered by my editor to be a prize. When you ring back after 6 days and he says, "What have you got?" "I've got an interview." "Who's it with?" "Oxfam." And that's it. That isn't the sort of the bee's knees, because obviously NGOs generally like to come on and talk about what they do. I was in Mali last summer, though, and again it's a similar example. Without the planning to try and bring home what's happening to people, you need to get out and about. And some aid agencies, for instance, don't like working with the military, because it makes it seem as if they're in league with them, and they're very uncomfortable about that. And often, if it's a place like some parts of Mali which are dangerous, they don't send international staff to them. They may say, "We could get local staff with you to go there and cover the story," but then our risk team at the BBC thinks, well, I'm obviously foreign, I will stand out, which is the reason they don't have international staff at the NGOs, and I can't always cover the story. Fortunately there, the Mali army agreed to let me in bed with them, and so I was able to travel around and see a lot more than I would have done. And culturally, it was very interesting too, actually, having that experience of long night conversations into the early hours with Mali army soldiers. I was recently in South Sudan too, looking at the issue of breastfeeding, something that was connected with Save the Children, who were trying to promote breastfeeding, particularly in the first hour of birth, and the value for that. And that is an example where you do need quite a lot of setting up, because if you just go there to talk about an issue like that, and you don't have anything more to say than "it's good to breastfeed," you could say that really in a paragraph. That could be your introduction, and people feel, okay, we got that, no need for any more then. But you've really got to engage people in countries that are a long way away, where it doesn't affect anyone's daily life. You want to get them sucked in so that they care, and to do that you need to get more facets to a particular story, to get personal testimonies that really move people. And also, in that case, to meet mothers who were saying, actually, I think this is a complete load of rot, this story about how we should be breastfeeding at the first hour of birth. We all know the first milk is rubbish, we throw it away. And having a woman saying that, and then asking her, although there was no proof there's any correlation here, but I asked her, "How many children do you have?" She said 6. And how many of those have survived? And she said 3. And you get an idea. The whole point was to help combat various diseases, to have mothers breastfeed as early as possible. And that I had a lot of help from an NGO with, which was really invaluable. But overall, I think my most important message is that it's great having the help where you can get it, because what we really need to do is to engage with the reports so that people feel it's something that matters to them, and they stop doing what they're otherwise doing in busy lives and they listen or watch whatever medium you're on, and that's always the essential thing.
Thank you, Mike. Sarah.
So I think that I'm here because I'm somebody who, in my job as head of international news at Sky, I sit and make decisions with a group of people, but decisions about where we'll go, when we'll go, who will go, and what stories we will go and cover. And it's a really difficult task, and it's a difficult task that is bound up with a whole lot of really boring logistical issues. At the heart of it is everything that Mike has been talking about. It's about telling amazing stories, compelling stories, stories of human beings who are experiencing extraordinary, amazing, horrific and horrendous experiences. And it is about getting those stories across to an audience who have a very busy life and making it mean something to them. So in this instance, I'm talking about sending our own teams. And sending our own teams means sending them from London or sending them from one of our bureaus around the world. But as soon as you go anywhere, the awful truth is it costs money. And as soon as you sit for 6 days waiting to speak to Oxfam in Khartoum, it is costing you money every single day. It's a plane trip for flights for X number of people, hotels, cars, local fixers, people who can translate, and just general living costs. And it mounts up. It mounts up hugely, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, if not thousands and thousands of pounds. So the reality with all of us media, is that we are operating with budgets which are finite, and therefore we have to decide what we think the stories are. It's really difficult decision, and we have to decide about when we will go somewhere and why we're going to go and do that story. And all of these things are about what your organisation does. So the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky, we'll all have slightly different remits. But in the world of international news, on the big ones, we all are basically in the same places. I think the best way of explaining how some of the decisions are taken is that in the last 6 months, I've done several group discussions like this. And in each of them, I've had somebody in the audience who's put their hand up and asked me why Sky News hadn't been to Mali at that point. Really difficult. I would have loved to have been in Mali last year. I would have loved to have been able to do what Mike did and get a team embedded with the military. But we couldn't get that access. We couldn't get the ability to know that if we went to Bamako, we'd be able to get out of the capital and do something that we believed would mean something. We couldn't get to the heart of what the story really was about, which was about this country split between north and south, divided between different beliefs and different ethnic groups, etc. We couldn't get to it from Bamako. And so while we couldn't get to it, we didn't send. Then, of course, events accelerated, and we get to the state of affairs recently, and there was it was like the things were happening everywhere. Once they called in the French, once we knew that others were getting involved, once we knew that there was a really very serious fight going on, and there were things that were going to happen on a daily basis, then there wasn't even a discussion. We needed to be there quickly, and we needed to get in and tell that story. Now, those are two quite difficult decisions to take, because the story had been going on for some time. But we have to make the decision that we can tell a story that isn't just an Oxfam interview, as Mike has said, and really deliver it well, and deliver it within our budget, so that all those other conflicts or humanitarian crises, etc., that are going on, they're all fighting for attention too, and fighting for our correspondents to go to, and our budgets, and our ability to tell that story within the framework of whatever the news is that the media are doing. So it's a really, really difficult equation. I'm really proud of what we do. I'm really proud of the stories that we do cover, and I'm really proud about the timing and how we turn up and try and tell those stories. But there'll be lots of people in this room that don't agree with that. And it's about sitting down and being part of that debate, which is why I think it's a really, really useful and important discussion to have.
Thank you, Sarah. So that's the initial press perspective. What about the government? What about the crucial role that British government traditionally has done in international aid and continues to do through DFID? Dylan.
So I guess I'm a bit like Sarah. I'm sitting making decisions on information coming into me about where the government should respond and providing advice to ministers. The media is absolutely critical. You'd be really surprised to know we have a daily monitoring in my team which informs us on what's going on. Quite often, it'll be media reports that are alerting us. So I think back to last April, there was a tsunami in Indonesia off the coast. We didn't know how strong that was going to be. That was picked up by the press, which enabled us to look into it. It also raised awareness of ministers, and our Secretary of State picked that up as well. So these kind of reporting are really essential for us in terms of raising the profile, getting information from places where we don't have staff necessarily, and really feeding back into our own systems. I think also the media is really critical, and again, I think it was something that Sarah said. It was something that Clive, you mentioned. You know, the UK public is quite generous. The DEC appeals rely on media to raise awareness. We are taxpayer funded, so if the taxpayers aren't seeing what they want to see, what DFID is doing in terms of the sort of humanitarian type responses, we are not going to be able to continue to fund the kind of programmes that we fund. And DFID was one of the largest donors to the international humanitarian system globally. So the media plays a huge role for us in terms of accountability to British taxpayers, supporting the voices of British taxpayers to ministers to help us to continue to do that kind of work. I think on the other side, the media's, probably the cameras are turned off too soon. I think there are a lot of challenges that people face in ongoing disasters. Clive mentioned the 90% of forgotten emergencies. There's stuff that we're doing which is maybe not picked up by the media but could be. There's good stories as well as bad stories. How do you pick up successes? How do you look at where the governments themselves, like for example in Haiti, are starting to try to look at where they can do things better? And I think perhaps there is a role for the media to pick up those things. The other side of this, for me, is about accountability to the affected populations. If you look to, for example, Christchurch, so the people in Christchurch use social media, okay, it's not the TV media, to find relatives. In Haiti, we were using mobile phone, SMS messages to tell people where they could go for help. Local journalists are really critical in terms of working up a response, providing that information to beneficiaries. The other important issue is that how do those people tell the agencies whether they've got what they want or not? Again, media is critical to enable the voices of those people caught up in emergencies to be able to start to do that. And I think the range of new technologies and social media and stuff we have, we need to take much more advantage on that. And maybe finally, just to sort of say that we have a really good partnership with organisations like ShelterBox through our new government toolkit. And we're really looking at where can we improve our relationships with the media. We're working with BBC Media Action, Thomson Reuters, Internews, to start to try and think about how can we engage locally, how can we be better prepared, how do we know who are local journalists when an earthquake happens in Kathmandu, for example, who do we talk to? So there's a whole range of things I think we can do much better. I hope that this discussion will help us to think through where we can create better partnerships with the media. But media, cameras, absolutely essential.
Thank you. How about from the NGOs? Ross.
Thank you. I think we follow very neatly on from that in so much as what we do as an organisation, and I'll come on to the sort of the what and the how in a short while, really lives on the lifeblood of the media in many respects, because we have a model of assistance that follows very closely the giving of the public, very often stimulated by press and media coverage. We're an organisation that I won't dwell on so much of what we do, that's up there, but essentially we work in the crisis and emergency phase in the very early days after a natural man-made disaster, and we specialise in providing emergency shelter. And we do that mostly through a very sort of hybrid and developed tent. But we also do that with a very iconic green box, which brings a lot of NFIs that really target a family to help that family survive as the response spins up to be able to build that community back into a position where it can move forward. And we work in that very narrow area. To do that, we have to be very agile. And that means we will deploy teams on fairly scant information, and we will deploy teams to do a lot of discovery to see if there's a need for our solution and whether that fits the disaster in which they have found themselves. What that means to be agile, though, is that we need donor money to do that, and we need that donor money up front because we have to hold it in stock and we have to have the agility and the speed to be able to deploy that as quickly as possible. I, as head of operations, tie together that operational and that logistical balance, but also we're unique in so much as we use volunteers to deliver our aid. And again, that means that we are not going back to a project-based system to put a team together. We have specially trained volunteers on standby, and they fill in their availability on a portal, and we phone up and they go within 24 hours typically. So in order to do that, we need a lifeblood of information to be fed to our early donor public. And the media is vital in this. And what we've found that very often we'll see a politically based man-made disaster, if you like, attracts quite a political story. And the humanitarian need naturally falls to the bottom. I think we've heard that both, well, particularly from Mike. And a natural disaster will generate a much more humanitarian response. And we see a much more rapid response to assist us in that. But where we need to find ourselves is the fact that we need to be able to generate that the whole time when those unseen disasters are happening and they don't make the news in the media. Typically, I will be deploying a team every 3 weeks to all manner of natural and man-made disasters around the globe. But very few of them become obvious, and very few of them, therefore, attract the kind of income and the kind of donor attention that's generated by such a build-up, an upswell of media coverage. So we walk a very different and difficult balance as far as generating those stories for ourselves that try and gain income against keeping a neutral position that allows us to continue to operate in the field. And Lebanon, I think, is an excellent example. We currently have teams in the Bekaa Valley deploying kit and equipment, and there are a large number of stories that we could self-generate from that, but it would put in jeopardy our permissions to work there, and in some instances, it would put in jeopardy really our neutrality and our sort of moral obligation not to point our beneficiaries out to be victims. We are not there for reportage, we are there to assist, and that's a very difficult line to walk when assistance doesn't necessarily mean you can bring back the income that comes from the stories and the people you meet. And the volunteers I send out to the field come back with some of the most remarkable and heart-wrenching stories that I'm sure would be something that would find traction in the media. But it's whether we are in a position to use that both for fundraising and to enable us to work better in the field. So I think what sees us uniquely placed as an organisation is that business model that says, you know, we live really by the media upswell of exposure of humanitarian suffering, and we need to be able to bring that back in to be able to assist as quickly as we possibly can. And that's the niche we fill, and probably why we feel it most acutely.
Thank you, Ross. I want to pick up on one thing straight away. We probably have the least xenophobic press in the world. You know, it's unusual for a bulletin on any of our major broadcasters or on Sky to not feature foreign news every day. Whereas if you're in America, you know, you could go 4 weeks without seeing or hearing a mention of Europe, let alone anywhere in the Middle East.
I'm sure they'd have something to say about that.
But Dylan's very gentle charge. The cameras are sometimes turned off too easy, too early, and too quickly. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, I think it's an easy criticism, I suppose. I think that we would all like to be in places for a long time. I think that there are always stories that human stories are going to continue sort of on the compounding misery of a horrific earthquake or whatever is not going to be cleared up in a week. I think we try and stay for the duration that we feel that there is a kind of compelling story, really. And again, and I hate to sit here and sound like the sort of money person, but ultimately it's costing money every day, which is important and absolutely the right thing to do if that story is moving and changing and needs to be continually told. Now, the one thing I will say is that all of the big news organisations subscribe to agencies, to Reuters, to AP, to various other agencies. So just because we pull our specific teams out doesn't mean that we just don't ever do the story. Or equally, having, as I gave my example about Mali not having gone last year, that didn't mean that Sky News didn't do the Mali story. We absolutely did. We used social media, we used agency footage, we used what we could to tell the story of what was going on last year. But we didn't have our own reporter and reporting team in the country. And I think that takes us on to another discussion, really, which is about what does a British audience, who we're talking about here as the donors to the aid organisations that we're talking about, how do they view the stories that are done by, in my case, a Sky News correspondent and team, and something that we will put together, and some of them are incredibly powerful and very, very brilliant pieces that we'll put together from London, let's say, from a UK correspondent who will put together agency footage, maybe some incredible material that's been shot by, let's say, an activist in Syria, or somebody who's really they may be risking their lives or putting themselves in quite serious situations to bring this extraordinary footage, and we put that together, and that goes out on a regular basis on all of the channels. What is the impact of that? And the reality is that the impact isn't as great. And there is some evidence that actually having a correspondent team, it makes it easier for people to relate to what's going on there, draws them in more. And that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting, and it's, are we sure about it? Is it questionable? It's important. We subscribe to agencies, hugely important. They are everywhere. We can't possibly be everywhere. We spend lots of money subscribing to them so that they can bring us stories from all over the world that we will put on different output at different time across the media. I also think actually with the increase in digital platforms and all the different media organisations have mobile and tablet and online and whatever, where you actually have many more stories than the traditional, BBC News at 10 or ITV News at 10 or even Channel 4 News. Their story count is actually very low. A kind of 10 o'clock news. I used to work at the BBC, so a 10 o'clock news bulletin traditionally has 9 stories that go out, 9 or 10 stories. Digital platforms have multiple stories, and actually, therefore, you are going to get many more of these sorts of stories out there. But what is it that makes a difference between somebody watching a story and carrying on their daily life and going, we should be doing something about that, and actually affects that decision making where they go, I want to do something about that, sitting at home in their kitchen or wherever it is, and say, I actually want to actively get involved in that. It doesn't really answer your question about are we turning off the cameras too soon, but I think it's sort of part of the discussion.
Let me turn to you, Mike. Sarah's primarily broadcasting to a UK audience. Yeah, there is a footprint in Europe as well, but it's fundamentally a European footprint. BBC is in receipt of nearly £4 billion of our money. Regressive poll tax, we won't go into that. But you have a duty beyond the UK. You have the World Service, you have a World Television Service. You don't have the limited budgets of commercial broadcasters. Are you turning the cameras off too early?
Well, of course, I suppose in Sarah's case, as she said, she's got great experience in the BBC as well to talk about that. But I think it's a case of, like when I mentioned Niger, and that was a case of trying to get in early, get the cameras, or in my case, the microphone, as it wasn't a bimetrial trip, get the microphones in there early, and try and report on things that actually can make a difference insofar, I mean, a literal difference, rather than reporting when things are already all sort of falling everywhere, and it's a bit late. All you can do is say, this is terrible, isn't it? But at that point, the humanitarian crisis that was foreseen hadn't yet happened. It was sort of starting to happen, but hadn't totally happened. I think when we say the cameras, if I can also extend this in a radio term to the Today programme, we are lucky to have an editor there who is very keen to, I mean, for instance, I was commissioned to go to the Central African Republic a few years ago. I mentioned that the place was in turmoil and there was no government control outside of the main capital, etc. But the biggest reason that my editor wanted me to go was because he said, I know absolutely nothing about the place other than it's in obviously Central Africa, but I can see there are enormous problems, but I don't know what's happening there. That's a reason to go. Now, many editors would say that's a reason not to go because it was not going to be in the bulletins. I mean, I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan and Haiti and all these places that were in the bulletins all the time. But this is a very different type of story. And it was, in a way, going back to your question, this was trying to say, look, virtually nothing's being heard about this country. The BBC is in the position of having licence fee payers' money where it can go and look at this type of information and inform. And it's much harder for commercial broadcasters when it's not going to make the bulletins. And of course, I mean, I know certainly, and I'm sure Sky does this, and I know Channel 4 does it, Unreported World, fantastic series. They do it. But the BBC also has a role to do it, and I've been very supported at times when most of what I do, I suppose 80% is what I suggest, it's not what I'm given to do. And there's quite receptive ears, and now we're much more bimedial, so very often my colleagues in World Service Television and also the domestic bulletins will take a portion of what I'll do. But a point that Sarah made about budgets and saying, you hate to talk about money, but it's a reality, and the BBC's money pool is also shrinking. There are times when you don't have the money to do all that you'd like, and for many disasters around the world, we have to also consider that we're not an NGO. Any of us broadcasters, whether we're BBC, Sky, ITV, we are there to cover stories. And I often find myself getting rung up by people who tell me, we've got people suffering here and suffering there for different reasons. And I've had to say to them, look, this is of great concern and it's a big issue, but it ain't a story. I can't just go and cover something because people are suffering, because sadly they're suffering in so many parts of the world, and people at home will think they're suffering too in a different way. But we need stories, and I think there too, organisations like ShelterBox, and we're hearing here how obviously there's a limit to what you feel you can say, particularly in Becker Valley and places like that, for your own reasons. But it does sometimes require imagination from organisations that are trying to highlight problems in the world, to think beyond just, we've got people suffering, let's get it on the media. Try and think of, for instance, if you can come up with case studies where there are people that would illustrate the story so well. There's somebody you've talked to who's happy to speak, and you check with them, and they're a good speaker, which is another problem. If people have lots to say, but when it comes to a camera being turned on or a microphone, they clam up. Understandably, it's very intimidating, but they do that. Then obviously it's not going to work. And I just think it needs all of us, not just the media to think, but it needs NGOs to think, and anybody else who's not in the media, not an NGO, but noticed an issue and wants it to get it on air. Think of a way where, you can persuade the media. You can get them to see or hear this story or read the story in the press corps, which is a vital part of the media.
Thank you, Mike. One area I just want to explore before we open it up to the audience. There seems to be a new debate, certainly amongst the MPs of the major coalition party, that this wonderful gift that we give to the world of aid through DFID should be channeled away from humanitarian aid in part and now go into peacekeeping and go into education and other areas. If politics start interfering in aid, is it going to put the lives of the people that Sarah is sending into the field, or Mike when he goes into a dangerous part of the world, or even some of our NGOs? People on the ground are going to start getting confused about what's aid and what's politics. Are you starting to play with the safety of British journalists?
I think it's a really important point. I mean, protecting humanitarian space is absolutely fundamental for everything that we do. And I think, there have been... Obviously, we as the government collectively need to look at how we use the government tools to the best service of the government's role. I mean, in DFID's case, it's about saving lives and improving the lot of people affected by disasters and actually much broader than that, poverty in general. If we can have more impact through using Foreign Office political processes to help open humanitarian space in the north of Yemen, for example, then we should be doing that. Equally, if we can use military, as we did in Haiti, to bring much-needed supplies in through a boat which could roll supplies on and off very easily, then we should do that. Of course, there are certain places we shouldn't be using the military. So we certainly shouldn't be using the military in conflict zones where we might become party to the conflict. And I think that this debate within government has opened up a number of questions. I hope that what it will do is it will enable us to deliver a more effective aid programme, but within the constraints that we know and that are defined in our own humanitarian policy, that are defined by ODA rules, that actually there are limitations of what you can use the military for and what you can't use the military for. And this is a debate that's happening at the moment. So I suppose I can't say too much on the sort of internal discussions, but certainly I think we see it as an opportunity rather than a threat, but we recognise the massive threats of getting it wrong. And I think journalists, NGOs, our own staff, working in very, very tricky situations, if those staff can't work there, we can't save lives. And we certainly don't want people to suffer from our own organisations as well as a result of government decisions.
And how about the NGO perspective or ShelterBox perspective? You already talked about security risks you're currently facing. Do you think if this sort of multi-stranded approach to aid, Britain is one of the few countries to actually step up to its international obligation of 0.7% of the budget. What's your perspective on this new debate within the coalition?
I have to also confess to a different angle to this as well, having worked with DFID as a member of the military, and where I can see there are instances. ShelterBox worked a lot with the 82nd Airborne in Haiti, who were only a matter of days out of a deployment to Iraq, and they had to change their entire footing and find themselves in Haiti, and that was a huge assistance to everybody involved, simply by logistics, organisation, a simple command and control structure that could tie things together in that part of the world, and they did, from every report I've seen, quite a remarkable job in doing that, and that I think is the absolutely right and appropriate use. I think having worked within a development role for DFID alongside in the military, that by its very nature becomes politicised assistance, because there is a political context against which you are working, and the difference between what I did then and what I do now is the beneficiary is the most vulnerable and the most needy, and it doesn't fit with any driven political aim or larger political assistance. So, used well, I think that debate is excellent. But what you need to find is that you will work with those organisations, and they will do as they are trained. You get what you're trained out of those kind of organisations, and therefore actually the debate doesn't necessarily need to sit with the NGOs and with DFID. It needs to go back to those partners that may provide in that way, and I think they are getting better at that, and I welcome it.
Okay, I'm going to open it up. Please identify yourself and which organisation you may represent before you pose a question. Gentleman there.
My name's Toby Ash. I'm a former journalist, and I've also deployed for ShelterBox in Pakistan and China. And it's interesting hearing the debate, and I think one thing that struck me, having been familiar with what ShelterBox is doing, being a journalist, is that really your chances of surviving a disaster are really to do with where the disaster is and the scale of the disaster, because it's an accessible place and it's a big disaster, the cameras are going to be there, and then the aid will follow, which to me, I'm not an idealist, but is sort of morally unsatisfactory. I mean, I deployed 5 years ago to Balochistan in Pakistan. There was an earthquake there. It was on the Afghan border. We were virtually the only NGO there. 50,000 people had lost their homes and were homeless. And it was winter, but the security situation was so bad that very few journalists, even the BBC, were very reluctant to go out there to see the aid, to see the situation, and to report back. So in fact, it was reported on the World Service and had a little bit of press coverage, but really nothing to really generate the volumes of aid that were really needed to deal with the humanitarian situation there. And I think looking ahead and looking at countries now like Pakistan and the security situation there, at Afghanistan in the next couple of years, I mean, if there was a major earthquake now in Waziristan, that hundreds of thousands of people could be affected, many thousands killed. My fear is, because of the security situation, is that in fact there won't be any media coverage, and in fact those people would really be left left on their own. Would you agree?
We'll gather up some questions and then maybe get a response, particularly from Sarah and Mike. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name's James, and I've just recently started work at Save the Children, where I watched the documentary The Trouble with Aid. So my question is about, we've heard how charities use the media in terms of a source of information, but then also as a mechanism for raising income and then furthering their response. But what I'm sort of wondering is, The Trouble with Aid was quite, not necessarily critical, but certainly didn't idolise the work of charities. And what I'm sort of interested in is how does the media perceive or use charities, and are they sort of wary of being critical of NGOs in the initial response? And do you often find that you're exceptionally accepting of the statistics and the information that NGOs are pushing at you? Because you must get that sort of stuff all the time from charities wanting to get their various messages out.
Okay, I'll take one more and then we'll get a response to three at a time. Lady there.
Budget and accessibility aside, how do you prioritise one disaster over another? Do you think about what the British public want to hear, or do you kind of decide what you think should be going out there?
Okay, so security, how does the media use the humanitarian agencies, and how do you prioritise disaster? Strange question.
I'm going to pick up on this question first. We have a very good working relationship with aid organisations. It's kind of symbiotic. I think we all kind of, realise that we're going to hear interesting stories from them, and they are potentially going to help us out. But I think that we have to be realistic about the extent that relationship is going to kind of develop. Now, sometimes we go with an aid organisation to somewhere because they have an infrastructure that enables us to get there. So it may be that they have an infrastructure to get to a refugee camp, and they have we'll fly to, Kenya to Nairobi, and then they'll take us up to the Somali border, and we'll be able to get to a refugee camp to tell a story that we want to get. It may be that they have contacts that can help us. It may be that they have an entire project that can illustrate, perhaps, potentially, where British money is working or is being used. So there are all. That's the sort of the good news end, and there's a lot of that happens. But I think we have to be realistic that also that can mean that you get either caught in a world of aid and NGOs, and is that the whole story? To my mind, it's not the whole story, because actually there's a whole story why these people are in the camps that they're in and what's happened outside. Quite often, I think Mike's already talked about his experience of the fact that actually, in a lot of places, the NGOs can't take you beyond where you can get to yourself. So is that as important as it sounds? Yes, in some places hugely important, and in others not. Do we feel that we can be critical of aid organisations? Yes, because we will always go fundamentally under our own steam. Now, they may have been able to drive us in or fly us into that last bit to get us there. But unless we are absolutely true to our objective credentials and are able to comment on what we see when we get there, nobody will trust us, and there is no point in us being there. So there's no point us arriving to some catastrophic, I think that actually quite often you hear in the media that the agencies are unable to cope because they're so overwhelmed. Now, the agencies might see that as quite a good thing that we're reporting, because that might mean that they get more money. But actually, that's us being critical. They haven't got enough people there. They haven't got enough stuff. There aren't enough of the right kinds of people there. There isn't enough of the right kind of stuff to help the people who are there. And so I think that we have to be true to our credentials. And I think that's absolutely right. We have a good relationship, but we are the media. They are the NGOs. We both have our own jobs, and we will both continue to do our own jobs, true to our own ideals. Morally difficult? Yes. I think it is. I think that every decision is a decision that we have to take based on what we do. And I think that what we have to remember is that we're journalists, and we are telling a story first and foremost, and Mike's been incredibly eloquent about that, and I'm not going to go over that discussion. But ultimately, we are bringing stories to our audiences, to people who are coming to us to hear about what's going on in the world. I think that people, we do tell stories that potentially we're not there for. We do tell them because we're more and more we're hearing from people who are there, who are able to communicate on social media and in other ways that aren't the traditional fly in, we're a big TV crew and we're going to be able to sort of satellite uplink out of here. We can tell those stories in different ways. And I'm incredibly proud of being able to get onto a 24-hour news channel. Lots of voices from all over the world that tell their own story. And I think that that's really important. I think the question is, does that garner the finance that will then support the aid organisation? We're important in that equation, but actually our job is to make sure we're reporting stories. And how do we report, how do we decide? We decide on the basis of the story, and we decide on the basis of the story that we believe is going to develop, and the story that is going to have an impact and is going to, once we get there, and I think that's a hugely important part of it. So I think this plays to your comment. We need to arrive somewhere, which can take a long time. We need to have the ability to operate there, which can take a long time, 6 days to speak to Oxfam in Khartoum. We have to then be able to deliver something that has meaning and communicates with our audiences, whether they're international or national. And I think that all has a really important part to play in it. So our decisions are each story to its own merit, each place, each fact, each deployment has completely its own lifespan, really, and each one you can argue a million ways, and eventually you have to make a decision. Otherwise, you don't get on the plane and you don't go. So at a certain point, we have to say yes or no, we'll go. And we try to do it to the absolute best of our ability and to the stories that we believe are important, will have impact, that will connect with our audiences. But it's not a science.
Anything to add, Mark?
Not a lot, I think. So we had the question about whether you trust aid agencies, and which Sarah's also talks a bit about. I've worked with one agency where it was on sweatshops in India. Terrible abuse of workforce there. But I found out with the agency that I worked with, they were led very much by the heart rather than the head. And I was told things like initially that these people were employed on illegal wages that breached the legal minimum wage. That these were illegally employed workers. Went out there to discover that the union representative they'd got this from didn't even know what the actual rate was, the legal minimum rate was for this group of workers. And admittedly in India it's complicated, so it wasn't that simple, but nonetheless if you're the union rep, and this is, stories come from you as a local sister group of an NGO, you should know this. And I started to find I had to completely rethink what I was doing, and at one point nearly called the whole thing off, because it wasn't anything to do with any attempt to deliberately deceive me, but the NGO concerned had simply not checked their facts. And I remember, in fact, in London asking, how much are these people paid? And the answer was, it's just an abysmal, an awful wage, just terrible. Okay, how much are they paid? As I said, it's just abysmal. It's an outrage. But how much are they? How much actually? Could you tell me, please, how much are they paid in facts? And I'll check that for you. And again, you know, this wasn't, and I really felt the person who was telling me this was very motivated, very sincere. It wasn't an attempt to deceive. They had nothing personal to gain whatsoever. But there was just this feeling of a crusade and not examining the facts. And in fact, I also did one report looking at aid, and when we talk about the pros and cons of aid, I did a few reports on the Today programme, one for World Television, looking at this, and to the point where I was facilitated by Oxfam at a trip to Sierra Leone. In fact, commissioned by the actor Colin Firth, funnily enough, who's a guest editor on the Today programme, wanted me to look at aid, and we hear there are problems with aid. Are there big problems? If so, what are they, and are there solutions to them? And the person that Oxfam put up was a very pleasant guy who had spent about 25 years in Sierra Leone, really knew the country well, and gave me some very honest answers. But some of them, to the press officer, weren't quite what you thought she certainly had gone all that way to facilitate. And I had a meeting about a week later with their head of press, who were very concerned, was I on a personal anti-aid crusade here because of the issues that I'd raised? I think also because Colin Firth is also an ambassador for Oxfam. But I said to her at the time, and I believe it is true, that if you can air these things, the public too, people listening and watching and reading the newspapers, will also sometimes wonder these things, and some of the points that I know that you put, they will wonder these things, and I think we need to deal very honestly with them and examine them, and it's not a perfect world, there aren't perfect solutions, and sometimes there's questions you can't really answer. So far as the security question is concerned, that's always a big dilemma, and I've got a report out, and no advert here, for the State Programme tomorrow, which you kindly mentioned, Clive, going into Sinai, and that took days of negotiation with my own colleagues at the BBC before they'd allow me to go. And my editor was quite behind it, but for all the other people involved, great nervousness and the knowledge these are dangerous places, and as where you mentioned. And so it's a battle. You can have a journalist totally wanting to do it, and in fact I think generally journalists do want to do these things, and if you want to go somewhere where the people are experiencing the really raw side of life, a bit like, we all talk about still, remember the Second World War, the First World War, because these were when we were all, well, in fact, not most people in this room probably, but our parents and grandparents were tested to the limit. And people don't forget those moments. And now you go somewhere as a journalist where people are facing the most incredible things, sometimes the most awful, awful things. And I've been in places like DR Congo and as well as Haiti, and actually found some really inspiring people. Not a tale of misery there, but what people have done with that misery is extraordinary and really uplifting for so many people. But getting there, going back to what you were saying, sometimes people just say no. Sorry, and I've been told no on many occasions. Sorry, Mike.
We'll take some more questions. A small sort of issue on security. I was flying into Mogadishu last year, and as I was flying in for the DEC, the UN rep turned to me and said, "Did we give you the security briefing yesterday?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did we tell you that 7 aid workers have died in the last week?" I said, "No." He said, "Don't worry about it. 5 of them were Belgian." Sorry, a lady there.
Mine's more of a kind of direction as opposed to a question. And I just wanted to discuss Syria, which I think is particularly relevant, given DEC has yet to launch an appeal in that regard. And the question's more about how it's not necessarily where you choose to report from, but often how you frame the complex emergency or humanitarian crisis itself. And in relation to Syria, I think this is particularly relevant because what you have is, I would argue, a disproportionate amount of emphasis on refugees and then a discussion about the conflict. And what's missing from that is the understanding of IDPs and the amount of the humanitarian crisis within Syria. And I'm not sure if that's reported by the media as much, and I'm not sure if that allows the public to not necessarily understand the emergency to its full extent, and potentially allows humanitarian organisations to maybe get away with things in the fact that they're potentially not addressing what needs to be addressed in the current climate.
Okay. The gentleman there in the middle with the beard.
Hi, Sarah. When you were talking earlier about Sky's trepidation to cover Mali, and in the beginning, it was a very complex issue with lots of divisions between religion and geography and politics. But then, when the conflict became a bit more red hot, it suddenly became a necessity to cover. It's just like to clear that up. Is it a way of saying that Sky has less remit for context and sort of complexity and suggestions about looming conflicts, and isn't it a responsibility of all broadcasters to try and provide that before the fireworks? And just secondly, if an editorial decision is made not to concentrate on a disaster in a far-flung country that people are not really aware of previously, is it any surprise if it continues to remain as such?
One further question, lady there.
This was a question for Dylan. Hi. It was just with reference to something Sarah had said earlier about ultimately, well, I kind of got from both of the media, the responsibility of them is to bring the story. I just wondered how that relates to what you had said in your kind of opening remit about media being a means of accountability to the taxpayer, because it seems to be a bit of a contradiction if they're considering that they're bringing a story and you're seeing it as a means of accountability. The two don't quite match up.
Do you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very difficult for a government department to reach into all the homes of UK taxpayers. I think we can do better about demonstrating where their money is being used in an emergency. And for example, when you interview Oxfam or ShelterBox, it's probably British taxpayers' money that they're spending in those environments. But because they're under pressure themselves to in a way flaunt their logos for their own funding, the British taxpayers' element of that doesn't necessarily get the profile it should do. So I think there's more we can do to highlight where British taxpayers' funding is being spent. But I do think that actually reporting from the scenes of emergencies, if it's something that's probably in a main broadcast, we will be there. It kind of links a little bit to the question around security. I mean, actually, our decision-making process is only part to do with the media profile. A lot of it's around need assessment. A lot of it's about working with partners on the ground that are already there. And I guess, it is important that the media are sharing stories about what the aid agencies more broadly are doing, and then we as a government who are core funding the UN, the Red Cross movement, all of those agencies that you see on the ground need to make a better case and a better story about how the British taxpayers' money is actually featuring in that. So I think, yeah, bits of your question I agree with. It's not clear, and we probably need to be clearer, but I think also the media could sometimes be clearer as well about how DFID's funding and the government's funding is actually a much bigger part of the picture than they may often suggest.
How about Syria? You know, the Secretary of State, was it 2-3 weeks ago, announced major money is going from Britain.
Yep.
We had Valerie Amos, the UN Under-Secretary, making a major appeal from the Middle East. 1.5 billion has been pledged.
Yep.
How many times have we heard 1.5 billion being pledged? What's Britain doing on the ground in Syria? How bad is?
I mean, it's really critical. It's a really awful situation. You know, the situation that refugees are under is terrible. A lot of them living, in the countries around with domestic families, lack of services, violence against women and girls. You know, we know rape is high. There are all sorts of issues. It's very complicated. It's very complicated for the government because obviously Syria is still a nation state, so we're not inside Syria, but obviously our partners are, and what we are doing is generating and learning and finding out information from what's going on so that we can use that in our political processes. And I think this comes back to your point earlier. It's about whole of government approach here. So the Foreign Secretary has been leading on the political side of the Friends of Syria, and that's really critical in terms of bringing on board other influential nations, Russia, China, etc. At the same time, the humanitarian tract must be protected from the kind of political, and we are working with the Red Cross movement, with the UN, to look at what they're doing and make sure that they are targeting the people that they must be targeting, that they are accountable for what they're doing, and that we are understanding, the kinds of activities and the kinds of problems. So also when Syria does change the situation there, we are ready to do something a bit differently. I mean, I can't say too much about this because obviously there are lots of political issues, but it's something that's critical.
Is ShelterBox working inside Syria, or are you working in Turkey? Are you working in Lebanon? Are you working in Jordan?
We actually, all of those to a greater and lesser degree. So working within Syria, because of our specialisation, which works, as you can see on the picture up there, with a very large white dome tent, with the levels of internal displacement and fixing people to the ground in what is a very fluid. It's a battle where people will bring together their forces to have a decisive effect in a single place at a single time, and then they dissipate and move their efforts elsewhere. It's a very transitory kind of a battle at the moment. And it's what we've seen probably is the pattern for over a year now. Well, fixing people inside a tent in that way we consider still to be unsafe for the beneficiary, not least in the short term, but more so in the longer term, as the Free Syrian Army has a stated policy that it is the duty of every Syrian to assist the Free Syrian Army in its fight with the Syrian government. So we hold a concern that the first time the Syrian Army find a Free Syrian assault and they see that kind of thing somewhere nearby, then they are going to put together the two, and one is then permanently associated with another. And if you have a mobile, loosely banded group like the Free Syrian Army, that green box with that tent in it is extremely attractive to assist them in what they do. So we have some major issues with distributing tents, particularly inside Syria. What we have done inside Syria, we did through Turkey, through some of our partners, and we sent in non-food items, blankets, ground sheets, petrol cookers, stuff that was appropriate to the internally displaced, and we moved them down into the north of the country with a view really to pushing them through into Homs. What actually happened through our partners was we found that the need was so great between there and the border that actually there was as much case to distribute to those that were trying to work their way out the country on the way in as there was to go to the original point of need. So we've continued to partner with those guys through Turkey, and we hope to do more of that. But tents inside Syria for us aren't appropriate. We have put tents up in camps in Domiz, which is northern Iraq, effectively Kurdistan, which I think is probably the most stable area in all of this at this stage. Greater Kurdistan is pretty good. Jordan, it is a very politicised fact in Jordan. Tents are usually fairly non-controversial, but that whole region lives with that Palestinian refugee camps as a hangover, and they have real issues with establishing camps. And we found the political will to be very much against that kind of settlement. So what we've done in Lebanon, and it's been very hard work, is get a response of 700 of our boxes are now being distributed in the Bekaa Valley. And what we've had to do is guide that in such a way that I think we have 27 different local groups and implementing partners that we are using to make sure we target all the communities as appropriately as we can. So we work straight through from Sunni, Shia to Druze to Christian to Alawite in some areas, and we make sure that that spread is there, mostly to alleviate the overcrowding in the immediate communities and the host communities, but also we use it in a micro distribution way within those communities to avoid the establishment of a camp, which frankly, it has been an extremely difficult journey to get that kind of aid into Lebanon because of the reasons I explained previously, but actually done in that way and done cleverly and at a micro level, you find a way through. And that's really what we kind of special. We're about that sort of size that we can do that kind of bespoke fit for whatever the need is. So the answer is, yeah, in all the countries surrounding and in some respects into Syria, but not in our normal model.
I think it's the issues within Syria that's the major problem for the DEC and for the broadcasters. You know, there is a need. We're confident that most of our agencies can meet that need. Most of them are working inside Syria as well as the surrounding countries. But it's a bloody dangerous place. And if you've got a number of aid agencies working on the government side, you know, they don't necessarily want to reveal that because they can get shot at by the rebel side, and vice versa if you're working behind rebel lines. And some of our agencies are working on both sides of the line. So it's a very fraught circumstance. And the DC has to go through its own processes. You know, is there a need? Can we meet the need? Can we get the publicity? But the broadcasters have to go through that process too. And they have to be confident that they can tell the story and get behind the story. So there will be, I'm pretty certain, the DEC appeal fairly soon, but we have to work with the broadcasters very closely to ensure that they can tell the story, and they have to reach their own decision. Just because the DEC says there is a disaster doesn't necessarily mean that independent broadcasters who have to go through their own editorial processes and meet their own criteria about impartiality and neutrality and lack of bias, that, you know, they can be satisfied on that. We've had problems in the past with the BBC in Gaza, and we don't want to go through that. So it's an ongoing and very good and active debate between us and the broadcasters, but it's often a question of timing and a question of, you know, can we get the story out? Because the concern of broadcasters is that they need to have their own eyewitness accounts of what's going on the ground, rather than being reliant on pictures coming back from agencies. And in big things like this, they need to make their own decisions. But Sarah, about the issue of Syria, but also about the issue of the raised about Mali and conflict.
Yeah, just briefly on Syria, I think it's pretty obvious why there's a concentration on refugees in bordering countries. It's because the media can get there relatively safely, and it's a way of telling the story. However, every single media organisation that I know has put journalists into Syria at incredible risk to those teams. And those people who go in and out are incredibly brave and doing an amazing job to bring the stories they do. I actually disagree with you that there isn't that there's been too much concentration on refugees and on displaced people. I think that we have actually reported an awful lot on fighting. It's one of the things that I think that in a way, we've almost got hijacked by the fighting, and the fighting isn't really something that's moving forward. I mean, if you go back to kind of what happened in Libya, we all got very stuck down in kind of eastern Libya, in Ras Lanuf and down beyond Benghazi, and it was about kind of road territory and back and forth, and sort of the same thing happened. We've got slightly obsessed by groups of people taking bits of airfields or not, or streets or not, within towns and in Syria, all of which is important in the way that different sides are chipping away at each other and what's going on. But actually, it's the people who are being affected. And the people are either internally displaced or they're refugees outside. And that's a hugely important part of the story, and something that sometimes I think we kind of need to get back to. We are going to be on the Jordanian border tomorrow, and I think it's hugely important, given the numbers that are going to be announced tomorrow, that we do that. So I think that we are doing the story to the absolute best of our ability. We are trying to do it as well as we possibly can. But in my career, which is long now, and has been in a lot in international news, it's one of the most dangerous stories that I've ever told, and I am incredibly proud of every single journalist who goes in there and brings a story out, because it's a great risk. On Mali, I absolutely, we are absolutely about context. We are absolutely about telling stories, spotting them when they're happening, flagging them up, telling people about them, giving that context. But we don't necessarily do it by being there, because we can't always be there. We will if we can, and if we can get in. My point about Mali was that actually we couldn't get the access that we needed to tell a story that I thought would make the impact. We could have gone to Bamako, but we couldn't get out to anywhere else. So we chose to tell the story in different ways, and we did do the story on many occasions. When we realised that we were in a position where we could potentially get embedded with the French, or be able to get up to Mopti or wherever it might be, we took that opportunity and we realised that we could tell the story. And I'm incredibly proud with what Alex Crawford and her team did in getting into Timbuktu. So we absolutely need to tell context. These stories are nothing without context. Just to turn up and say, oh, there's a fight going on, doesn't tell anybody anything. Context is absolutely everything in the background. But it's about when you decide to deploy and what it is that you can actually achieve when you go. And that's absolutely the part of the decision-making process.
We're overrunning dreadfully, but I'll try and take three more questions, there, and there, and we'll get quick responses. Lady there.
Thank you. Just getting back to the core of the debate, which is it a disaster if the cameras are not there to bear witness to what is happening, and how essential that is, whether it is a very populous discussion and debate that the wider world would be interested in, or a more narrow, very selfish debate. And I'm a photojournalist, and for me, it's essential, I think, to be able to communicate what a story is all about via the pictures. And of course, you have to be selective in going into whatever area, whether it's a disaster, war, conflict, and maybe a love match, for that matter, a sporting event. But the essential thought and the debate that I'd be interested in what the panel has to say is the difference between a professional going in and thinking about what they need to capture and be able to tell an objective, real story that has gravitas, versus which we are flooded with, everything on YouTube and a whole host of other citizens' photography, and both play a role because we are dealing with social media. And so I'd be interested in the panel's view of, is it a disaster if the cameras aren't there?
Okay. Gentleman there.
The two media people on the panel have for obvious reasons, concentrated on the issue of story. And of course, when there's a big disaster, which is what I'm talking about, there's a story, and the story is made usually very well, and money floods in. And then, as you imply, the story starts withering away, and you can't stay there forever. But hey presto, after a while there's another story which is always used, which is that the money's been misspent in one way or another. Either it's gone in corruption, or in case I believe in President Clinton's charity in Haiti, tens and tens of millions of pounds are unspent, and so on and so forth. And this is not an unimportant question, because it reduces the amount of money that people give again. They get exhaustion and they say, well, it's all going wrong. So my question is, what is your smell of the situation? Do the media exaggerate this? Do they under-exaggerate this? How should they play it? And should they do it more, or should they do it less?
Thank you. And there was a gentleman over there. One other person? Yeah.
Thank you. I'd actually like to develop the last question, which is really the downside of media response on the crisis, particularly in terms of access, in terms of the impact that a lot of media profile can have on competition for profile amongst agencies on the ground, the diversion of management attention from operations on the ground at headquarters to following all of the profile, and also the diversion of resources away from other crises which are equally deserving. And of course, the reality is often in crises where there's an awful lot of money floating around, that quite often too much money is actually not what's necessary. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to split these three questions up. First, to the issue of eyewitness accounts. Some of the major aid agencies, Oxfam, Save the Children, can go into the field with their own satellite dishes, their own computers, and actually beam pictures back themselves. Do you need to have your own reporters? Do you have to know eyewitness accounts, or are you happy
I'd like to
at
answer
times?
that one. Although, again, I mean, Sarah has touched on it a bit earlier. Certainly from the BBC's point of view, I remember one time being waiting I was in DR Congo, and I was waiting to speak to a UNICEF press officer. I was kept waiting nearly 2 hours because he was in there making a film for UNICEF, which obviously for campaign purposes will have great use. But he actually had in mind this was going to, he said, rather than you go running around everywhere and me arranging interviews for you or helping you with that, I've got a film you can take away. And trying to explain to him that we don't, for a number of reasons, just use footage shot by, even say the UN, very respectable organisation, but you know, a BBC journalist was not involved, and I'm sure it's the same for most other broadcasters, was not involved in the production of this. If it turns out this was not properly researched, and a bit like my Indian sweatshop research, it turns out to be sort of factually very inaccurate, we as a broadcaster are blamed for that. And in addition, there's something else too, that I think the power of what you can broadcast does, again, to say she mentioned this, if you've got a correspondent on the ground, the difference it makes is extraordinary in what you can convey. I'm often told about stories that are happening around the world, and I'm given the information, and sometimes I can't go out and I do it from London, but however hard you try, it never has the impact that it does if you're there. And so there's two things, bringing that immediacy and your own descriptions and helping people who are listening or viewing or reading to identify with what you're looking at. It makes all the difference if you're there. And as I say, you can't just use agency footage. And I know it plays an invaluable place in campaigning and fundraising, but I often wish people would be more aware in agencies that there's a limitation to its use by the media.
How do you strike that balance, Sarah?
I totally agree with Mike. I mean, it is, there is just a massive difference in being there. It is hugely important that we are there to verify what it is, to bear witness, to tell the stories, to communicate to the audience. There is a place for some of that footage, and it is absolutely around an interview with an agency or a minister or whatever about something that is actually happening there, at which point it's very obvious to the audience what you're looking at. But there is a very big limitation, and we have this relatively anecdotal evidence that the difference it makes to communicating the message is massive, to have somebody reporting on the ground.
Accountability. You've got a lot of money in from a very generous nation, using Dylan's phrase earlier. How are you accountable? How do you make sure the money is being spent properly? And when a reporter arrives and starts questioning you on that, and indeed puts out a report that money's been misappropriated or been siphoned off into a bribe, how does ShelterBox hold
ShelterBox, I think,
itself to account?
yeah, and ShelterBox, I think, simply by the model and its methods, actually finds itself a lot less vulnerable to this sort of thing, because where we accept, the one size doesn't necessarily fit all, we plough just about everything we have into that ready stock. So it's a very simple business comparably, because we are not funding on the ground. We are delivering something that has already been bought and paid for. What that then comes down to is our teams that go out, and they are the accountability to our donors that say this kit and equipment has gone to the most needy in the best way possible. Now, we are a size of organisation that can't possibly help everybody, so we will always seek to target the most vulnerable. And where we can find difficulties is finding the most vulnerable and being able to access and use our equipment to the best possible ends. And that's where, again, you've heard it from Dylan all evening, that's where the partners come in, that's where the collective effort is. And making sure that we have the full context in which we're acting, which is what our teams seek to do. That's really how we remain clear and accountable that we have done the most that we can for the most vulnerable.
Accountability for DFID? You're spending billions of taxpayers' money.
I mean, I think on the question on the media, I think it's really important that the international media does pick up these issues, but I think there's a problem when that becomes the only story and it takes away from some of the success that is being delivered by agencies, and it becomes a means to bash aid agencies for those people that don't like giving aid. So I think it needs to be proportionate to what the real story is. I think it's really important that locally, local populations have a voice, that they are reported in their own environments on these kind of issues. So I think that for me is really essential. In terms of our own accountability on sort of corruption issues, we are very rigorous. I mean, the rapid response facility that I talked about earlier, which ShelterBox is a partner, we've gone through a hugely detailed pre-qualification process to get organisations that have robust policies in place. We work very closely through the UN and International Red Cross, and again, we monitor their processes and things that are in place themselves. However, that's not the only thing we do. We also visit ourselves. So I went to Haiti last year. I'm going back tomorrow to look at what the UK funds, how they were spent in Hurricane Sandy. Did the stuff get to the people that they said it was going to get to? Did the people actually like the stuff they got? So I think it's really important. We could do more of it. I think sometimes the media makes that the only story when it's not.
Do you make it the only story?
I think that there are times for different stories. And I think that there are moments when the stories that the gentleman asked about are the bigger story. And I think that if they are the bigger story and they're the more relevant story on that day, it's beholden on us to report that as the story. I think that what we don't do and can't do and shouldn't do is necessarily balance that within one programme with other stuff that's going on. I think that what you will see is the balance over time, that the work that is being done, the situation itself, the context, the crisis, is actually delivered as stories over time. But in certain instances, the kinds of stories of corruption or inability to function or whatever are the big story of the day, in which case that's what we'll report and that's what we'll do.
Do you over-egg sometimes, Mike?
Do I ever?
Do you over-egg the sort of downside of these stories sometimes?
No, I think as Sarah said, you get occasions where, like what I mentioned with the Oxfam case, I mean, I've done an awful lot with Oxfam and we've got a very good working relationship, but you get the odd time where the story in this particular case was how well aid is being spent, whether it's being spent in the right way, and what local people think of it, and how Oxfam justify their use of it, or any other organisation. Oxfam were brave enough to actually volunteer to take this subject on. But there are times, yes, when it is the story. And Haiti is a great example. It's been mentioned a few times. I mean, the enormous amounts of money that are said to have gone missing. I think if the media didn't look at that in depth, they'd be really missing a trick and would not be doing their job. Because also on the ground, I was told by a lot of people on several visits there since the earthquake that people are saying, asking me why, as a representative of the West, why are we still in tents when we keep getting told how much money has been given? Where has it gone? People ask me, one woman actually grabbed me by the lapel and said, where has it gone? Demanding an answer out of me. I mean, so we sometimes have to do that. But we can't worry about whether when we're doing that, we're damaging an aid agency. What I worry about, or aid agencies, or the whole concept of aid, I think all I do worry about sometimes is if there's a particular issue that I think will be picked up in a way that might totally overshadow what else is happening at a particular place at a particular time, then I think that's sometimes where I will feel it's going to be taken out of proportion or likely to be picked up that way, and it'll overshadow everything else we're trying to highlight. But otherwise, no, I think we've got to look at, come the day, there's a particular story, if it's about the benefits of aid or something that's going really well, great, or it's about the opposite, that has to be done, whatever.
I've got a question there from the gentleman about access for competition. Ross?
Yes, and in fact I think that's probably, I can look at the two questions as one there quite easily. And probably the best way would be an example of Hurricane Pablo, which hit Mindanao in early December. 16 million affected and 1 million have lost their homes. Now, had that been a sweet spot media moment, which had huge pickup, I am confident that our organisation would have step changed to meet that. And you're right, we have only a limited amount of time and resources, but that sort of need, we can only do what we can do to that level of need if we have the resources to do it. And so we have to, in some respects, move our attention to that. It wasn't a sweet spot for the media, therefore it didn't have the pickup it would have been for us to be a major income generator, the likes of Asian tsunami, Haiti, we keep hearing, in Japan, but it had every reason to be because of the need that it generated. So is it a disaster if the media aren't there? Well, I think it's self-evident in that example.
I've run over by a full 30 minutes, so I could probably wind it up there. Could I ever ask you all to thank a fantastic panel? And I hand to Ross to wind up.
Yeah, just very quickly, actually. Firstly, a big thank you to Clive for chairing what I thought was a very enjoyable debate from our side. Secondly, to the Frontline Club, quite an honour. My first time in here, so all you old hands are quite used to this, but to come in here and see the heritage that this place is steeped in has been quite an experience, and I'm very grateful for that. I can make some small recompense by saying, as a good Cornish charity, with a good Cornish brewer helping us out with some beer downstairs, it would be lovely if you would join us downstairs for a sponsored beer, and hopefully the debate will continue. But thank you to everybody. Thanks.